Hi, everyone. Welcome to our fourth seminar in the What Economists Really Do seminar series. My name is Lisa Martin. I'm a PhD student at the Economics department. And as chair of today's talk, it's my pleasure to welcome Barbara Petrongolo, who's a professor in economics and a professorial fellow at Nuffield College here at the University of Oxford. Barbara's research focuses on labor economics, with part of her work addressing causes of gender inequalities and labor market outcomes. So today, on International Women's Day, rather fittingly and not entirely coincidentally, Barbara will speak to us about the economics of gender pay gaps. And of course, I don't want to reveal too much of Barbara's presentation, but I don't think it's a surprise to you when I say that gender gaps remain till this day and remain large. So this is true also within the economics profession. We're still about only a third of graduate students and only about 15% of full professors are women. So here at the economics department in Oxford, we're pushing forward a number of efforts and initiatives to try to close these gaps wherever possible. And just as an example, just to highlight a couple of the student-led initiatives, for example, I've set up a mentoring scheme to match female PhD and master's students, and also co-founded a Women in Economics alumni network, where we're actually having our first career event tomorrow evening. So this is just to say the topic of today's talk is very close to my heart, and I'm already looking forward to learning more about the causes and also potential solutions for these persistent gender gaps. Just a couple of notes on the format today. Barbara will speak for about 35 minutes, and then afterward we'll open to a Q&A session where we will address your questions. So please do write your questions into the Q&A box during the presentation, just as they come to you, and I will bring them to Barbara after her presentation. And yeah, with this, I'm delighted to pass the floor to Barbara.
Thank you so much, Lisa, and thanks also to the organizers for inviting me to join this very interesting initiative. Thanks to people who came to listen to this talk. So as Lisa was anticipating, I will be talking about several broad perspectives and results on gender inequality. And as you may have already seen, this is one of a series of lectures that are meant to give a broad perspective of what economists do. So you may have already heard about some of the biggest issues that society is facing, like, for example, automation and the future of work, the economics of biodiversity, urbanization around the world. So today I'm going to talk about gender inequality. What are its potential driving forces, and what can policy do in order to aim for gender parity in the labor market? We argue that this is a very important topic because of its consequences, both for equality of opportunities, but also for the efficient allocation of resources in the labor markets and in societies. And also I should note the study of gender gaps has evolved dramatically in recent decades with new ideas, new perspectives, and most importantly, new data. So the study of gender gaps should acquaint students and researchers to some of the methodologies at the frontier of research these days in applied micro. Okay, so I will be talking for about 30-35 minutes about this, this broad topic, and then I'm very happy to take questions from the floor. So let me just get the presentation started. It is probably safe to argue that women's increased involvement in the economies was one of the most significant changes in labor markets during the past century. So women have made major inroads in education, employment, leadership roles, both in politics and the corporate sector, for example. And just to give a very simple overview about male and female investment in human capital, this chart here shows the proportion of the male and female population who is getting college education, so who has completed a bachelor's degree in a series, in a bunch of high-income countries. So the horizontal axis shows the share of male with college education, the vertical axis, the share of females with college education, and then you can see the diagonal, which is representing the 45-degree line. As you can see, most countries lie above the diagonal. So in most countries these days, younger generations have a higher proportion of graduates among men, among women and among men. Now, if you look at employment rates, similarly, there has been very strong progress in employment rates in all high-income countries around the world during the past half a century or even a century. So on this graph here, I'm plotting the employment rates of women in the US and the UK as far back as comparable data allow me to go, So you can see, for example, the blue line, which represents the US, shows a very steady increasing female employment between the post-war period and the end of the 20th century. So, for example, just at the end of World War II, only about 35% of women in the US were in paid employment, and this share had doubled by the end of the century. In the UK, the series is a little bit shorter, but as you can see, the data follow exactly the same pattern, the same trend as in the US. So there has been a very strong increase in female employment around the world. Now, another kind of positive, optimistic view about gender convergence is that this has happened against a backdrop of rising inequalities along most other dimensions. So these days, of course, the discussion about rising inequality is topical, not just in an economic sort of perspective, but also in the perspective of rising populist sentiment. And again, this kind of backdrop, the reduction in gender inequalities definitely represents a reason for an optimistic view. But what this talk will mostly argue, gender convergence is very far from being complete. So there are important hurdles to the path on gender equality in all countries, and this involves many aspects of labor market involvement. So, for example, women still make significantly different choices in education, and in particular, they make choices that are less conducive to financially rewarding careers. There are large and persistent gaps in employment and wages, and also where bear the whole economic penalty from parenthood. Now, of course, as you might imagine, there's also disparities in unpaid domestic work that men and women do, and the evidence has shown that the gender gap in paid work is more than offset by women's disproportionate involvement in domestic work. So on the whole, it seems that women are enjoying less leisure than men in total. Now, these facts perhaps seem surprising, especially because they happen despite equalized education opportunities and equal pay legislation in most of the countries that we are considering. So I should specify that the evidence I'm going to talk about today is mostly covering high-income countries. So to give you an idea about different gender choices in education, you can see on this graph, I am representing the proportion of graduates in STEM fields among men, and on the vertical axis, the same proportion among women. While I was showing you before that the share of graduates, overall graduates, is higher among women and among men, if you look at graduates in STEM fields, the gaps is reversed. So the share of men investing in STEM subjects is a lot higher than among women in all the countries that we have considered. And this may be important for two reasons, because these are the majors that are mostly conducive to financially rewarding careers. And at the same time, in an aggregate perspective, these are the majors that are most conducive to aggregate growth. This chart here represents a very broad overview of gender gaps in labor income around rich countries, relatively rich countries. Again, we're talking about the OECD group. So the vertical bars here represent the total gap in labor earnings around the world. And those gaps are decomposed into three main components. So the blue component reflects gaps in participation. So women are overall less likely to participate at all to the labor market than men in most countries. Then there is the red component, which is representing the gap in hours. So conditional on participating to the labor market, women work fewer hours than men. And then the third gap, which is denoted in green, is the gap in wage rates. So even conditional on the same number of hours, women tend to earn less on an hourly basis than men. And then, as you can see, this total gap varies from more than 20% in Scandinavia to nearly 80% in Japan. And the three components, they all explain some part of the gap. They all play some role. They each play some role in all of these countries. So we really need to understand what is the anatomy of the gender gap. And first of all, we really need to familiarize with the fact that those gender gaps are really humongous. Now, first of all, before going into the causes of what's going on, I'd like to first consider one question: why and whether this might be a problem. And then one can argue that there are two main reasons why gender inequalities might be a problem. Well, first of all, one can think about gender equity and an idea of social justice about men and women having equal opportunities in labor markets and society at large. but there's also a problem about the misallocation of talent. So there is no evidence that innate talent might be differentially distributed between men and women. If anything, girls perform better in school than boys and invest more in education. So the efficient allocation of workers to jobs requires that individuals do the jobs that maximize the returns to the skills. And if for some reason one ends up selecting mostly from one gender, this limits the pool of skills and on average worsens the quality of potential job matches. So one can really think about gender equality as a possible pathway to unlock untapped talent. So here I really want to stress that there's both an equity and efficiency argument to this. Now, this topic is of course extremely broad, extremely large. There is a variety of views that are discussed by economists these days. Of course, I will have to make some hard choices here. So at the cost of some oversimplification, I will classify existing explanations, existing perspectives for remaining gender gaps into two big families. One big explanation is about women and men being different in characteristics or traits that will make them differently productive or would endow them with different preferences with what they would like to do. So under this view about gender differences in traits, existing inequalities would be simply a reflection of those differences in preferences and productivity. Now, there are a number of traits that one may argue are indeed related to labor market success, especially in high-paying jobs. So, for example, especially financially rewarding careers may develop in environments that are very competitive, environment where one's performance is evaluated against the performance of the peers, and in which income is very volatile. So if somebody is particularly risk averse, or not too prone to compete against others, or particularly oriented towards altruistic or pro-social behavior, one may argue that this could interfere with their labor market success. So the questions that this literature has tried to address so far is about gender differences in risk-taking. Are women more risk-averse than men? Or are women less prone to compete than men? Do women shy away from competition? Are women more altruistic than men? And could this interfere with maximizing simply monetary payoffs from careers? And here the literature has provided a large set of experiments, mostly based on the lab, but also more recently on the field, that have studied gender differences in a variety of settings. One relatively simple way to summarize this literature is that despite widely held beliefs, also among economists, that men and women differ in those relevant traits, meta-analyses have shown that differences are relatively small, and more importantly, they're highly context dependent. So it's very hard to extrapolate from a given experiment about gender differences in, say, overconfident to a universal factor, a universal phenomenon. So I'm giving you some evidence here from a study that I recently carried out with a group of co-authors. So in this study, we surveyed economists. So these are colleagues who are relatively well established in the profession. And we surveyed about 1,000 of these people about what they think they have learned from the experimental literature that has investigated gender differences in overconfidence. So we had a response rate of about 35%. And this chart here represents what are the economists' responses on the question about gender differences in overconfidence. So on the horizontal axis, we plot the female normalized confidence. 0 represents being perfectly realistic. Above 0 means being overconfident. Below 0 means underconfident. And then similarly for men on the vertical axis. 0 is realistic, and then above and below is respectively overconfident and underconfident. As you can see from this graph, the very vast majority of economists is situated here in this northwest diagram, meaning that they believe that men are overconfident and women are underconfident relative to whatever is their performance in some kind of tasks. Okay, so about more than 3/4, about 80% of respondents believe that the situation is this. And then we did exactly the same exercise, but instead of asking our colleagues, we started looking at the papers. We started looking at empirical estimates that exist in the literature. And we summarized those empirical estimates in these horizontal charts, in these horizontal bars, sorry. So the first bar represents the previous diagram, the gender beliefs. As I was saying before, just over 3/4 of respondents believe that men are overconfident and women are underconfident. And then there is a minority of respondents who believe that both of them are overconfident. And then a very, very tiny minority, like 2%, who believe that women are overconfident and men are underconfident. So the first bar represents the beliefs. The second, third, and fourth bars represent the sample of studies, what the studies are telling us according to slightly different sample selection rules, but the picture is very consistent. So across all these samples, you can see that the picture is reversed. It's actually a very vast majority of studies that detect that both men and women are overconfident. And it's only a minority between 4 and 18% that detect that women are underconfident and men are overconfident. So the big question is, how come that relatively strong evidence about both genders being overconfident boils down to beliefs that are very gender biased according to overconfidence? And then here one can speculate about possible explanation. For example, if economists held very strong belief with very precise priors, then no matter how many studies we can take out and show that perhaps genders are behaving relatively similarly about their own self-confidence, perhaps economists are not willing to update their beliefs. Now, this point is also closely related to another concept about gender differences in traits, that usually when we talk about differences, what we really have in mind is differences in means. So we compare the mean confidence among men to the mean confidence among women. In doing that, we neglect that there might be very large differences within each gender. So there is one thing which is comparing the means in the distribution, and then the other aspect is really thinking about what is the overlap in the respective distribution. So perhaps there is such a big overlap that it makes much less sense to compare means than to think about gender differences, to think about within gender differences in behavior. So for example, this chart here represents the overlap in the distribution of self-esteem between women, the dashed line, and men, the solid line. So as you can see, there is a very tiny difference in the means, but the most important fact that comes from this diagram is that there is a huge overlap in the respective distribution. So this is to say that perhaps if we're really focusing on gender means in traits, we're not really looking in the right place in order to explain gender outcomes in the labor market. Okay, so let me go back to the variety of views, explaining what's going on. I will be talking mostly about barriers. So perhaps the reason why men and women have different fortunes in the labor market is because there are some sort of differential opportunities or barriers that prevent the full closure of gender gaps, for example, in employment rates and wages. And then again, these kind of barriers could be classified under two sort of umbrellas with a lot of overlap between them. We will see why. One is about work-life balance considerations, and the other one is about stereotypes and social norms, and then perhaps there are others, okay, and some interaction between the two. So talking about work-life balance, of course, naturally takes me to talk about women as the main providers of childcare, even in the current day and age. And this, of course, sets limits to their labor market involvement. And this is especially true in careers that require long hours, continuous attachment, and they're not very forgiving of career breaks. Now, there is one very important stylized fact that economists have now established, that motherhood has a clear detrimental impact on female earnings. And this kind of motherhood penalty is largely related to relative earnings potential, in the sense that even mothers who out-earns their partners before childbirth are more likely than their male partners to reduce their working hours in their years after childbirth. So this graph here shows the motherhood penalty in the UK and the US. So the solid lines represent the earnings tracks of mothers in the UK and the US respectively. The dashed lines are representative lines for fathers. So you can see that in either country, the dashed lines are almost completely flat. So childbirth is, largely speaking, a non-event for fathers. So fathers' earning trajectories are not dented by the arrival of children. On the contrary, both in the UK and the US, the arrival of children generates some sharp and persistent drops in mothers' earnings. And this kind of earnings penalty is something that seems to remain there permanently in the labor market, even 10 years after the birth of the first child. And this kind of penalty is explained in an accounting sense by all three components that I was mentioning before: gaps in participation, gaps in hours, and gaps in wages. Now, one may argue that the UK, and even more so the US, may not really have in place a set of family-friendly policies that, for example, would help young parents to go back to the labor market after having children. For example, one may argue that the provision of childcare subsidy is not really widespread as in Scandinavian countries. But then if we move to Scandinavia, you can see that the picture is qualitatively very, very similar. So those two countries are now Denmark and Sweden. One interesting point is that if you look at Sweden, the red lines, even the dashed line for fathers has a little bit of a dip after childbirth. And this reflects the fact that the Sweden parental leave system has a daddy quota of 2 months. So more parents in Sweden take parental leave than in other countries, and this generates a temporary dip in their earnings. But in the long run, you can see that father earnings really go back to the pre-birth level. Instead, for mother's earnings, there is a permanent gap, both in Sweden and in Denmark. Quantitatively, this gap is smaller than in Anglo-Saxon countries, but is still significant and permanent throughout the first 10 or even 20 years of experience in the labor market. And finally, moving to German-speaking countries, here this graph represents Germany, Austria, and Switzerland. You can see that here the childhood penalties are much, much bigger, up to 68% in Switzerland. So there is a child penalty everywhere, and it changes quite a bit across countries, and we perhaps still need to understand very much why this changes so much across countries, this varies so much across countries. So is this surprising, finding this kind of motherhood penalties? I mean, we should argue that yes, there is some surprising component in there because there have been many developments that should have leveled the playing field after childbirth in the labor market. So, for example, there has been plenty of time-saving technologies in the household, so doing household chores should take a lot less time than it used to in the past. There has been low-wage immigration in many high-income countries, which has provided relatively low wage and even relatively high educated substitutes to maternal childcare. And then, of course, there is a range of family policies that are supposed to help parents to combine careers and parenthood. But nevertheless, women with family responsibility still seem to demand job characteristics that seem to have a penalty attached in the labor markets. So what are those job characteristics? For example, women are more likely to value jobs with hours flexibility and control over the work schedules, opportunities to work from home, and short commutes. So one can think that perhaps these and other factors imply that women are more restricted when it comes to searching for job opportunities that maximize the return to their skills. So, for example, why gender gaps in commutes might be important? Well, they might be important because if somebody is constrained or unwilling to search for job opportunities further afield, they may give up opportunities for the best returns to what are their capacities and their skills. And an interesting piece of evidence, for example, is that if you look at the time pattern of the gender gap, you can see that the gender gap starts extremely small when people start their careers in their early 20s and then increases to about 25-30% towards middle ages. And then you can see that exactly the same pattern is followed by commuting gaps. So perhaps the idea that women, once they have children, are more constrained in the range of jobs they can consider can explain some of the gaps that we find in the labor markets. Okay, now this kind of differences in the type of jobs that men and women look for is taking me kind of naturally to talk about yet another factor for remaining inequalities, yet another factor of barriers in the labor market, which mostly has to do with prescriptive norms and stereotypes. So this seems to be a relatively natural way to investigate because the childbirth and the penalty associated to job flexibility will not necessarily be a women's problem if gender roles were equalized in the household. So in a sense, one should make a step back and think that work-life balance consideration perhaps are perceived as women's problem insofar as social norms induce asymmetric gender roles in the household. Now, one can think of norms as social prescriptions, what is appropriate or inappropriate for men and women to do. They can originate from intrinsically held beliefs, about something that can make you happy or unhappy, but also they can originate from peer pressure, peer influences, and also the need to sort of make beliefs, make ideas, while still saving on cognitive resources. So there are a variety of reasons why we may still think that gender roles play a role in female and male outcomes in the labor market. Now, whoever was living in the UK about 2 years ago at that time, you may remember this kind of government advert that was put out about staying home and saving lives during lockdown. So as you can see, this is what the government believes, the way the government believes we should have been staying home and saving lives. So the first picture represents a family sort of relaxing on the sofa. The first picture has a woman looking after a baby, possibly changing nappies. The third picture is a woman doing homeschooling and childcare. The fourth picture is another woman doing chores. And even this kind of advert is kind of ingenious because it even embodies some kind of intergenerational mobility of conservative norms. Because in the first vignette, you see a little girl helping her mother, presumably doing the chores. You don't see a little boy. So this advert, of course, understandably attracted quite a lot of criticism and was promptly removed. But this is really an idea. This should give you an idea of how pervasive stereotypes, gender stereotypes might be, even in this day and age. So, of course, stereotypes and norms are difficult to measure, but one can perhaps these days can use a very valuable source of information that comes from value surveys. These are surveys in which a representative sample of the population is interviewed in many countries about views and beliefs on a variety of aspects. So, for example, beliefs about religion, politics, government's involvement in society, gender roles, etc. So this chart here gives you an idea of beliefs across a large number of countries, beliefs held by both men and women about a number of gender issues. So, for example, women with young children should not work full-time. As you can see, most countries are sitting here on the 45-degree line. So men and women across countries share very much the same beliefs. In countries in which women have conservative gender beliefs, men are also likely to hold the same conservative gender beliefs. Similarly, about if a mother works, preschool children are likely to suffer. Working mother cannot have a warm relationship with children. Men should work, women should stay home. All those statements represent relatively stereotypical views about society, and the proportion of the population who agrees with this statement varies a lot across countries, but doesn't really vary within countries across genders. Why are gender norms important? You can see from this chart, for example, that there is a very wide variation in the proportion of the population across country who agrees with the statement that a preschool child would suffer when a mother works. So this proportion goes from 10% in Denmark all the way up to 70% in Italy, Greece, and Turkey. And this proportion is strongly correlated to the gender gap in employment rates. Similarly, you can see that the proportion of the population who agree with a very similar statement across countries, which I'm here representing on the horizontal axis, is very strongly correlated with the long-run earnings penalty from motherhood. So, for example, in the bottom left-hand side corner, you have Scandinavian countries with relatively low childhood penalties and low proportion of stereotypical norms. At the other end of the spectrum, you have Switzerland, in which 90% of the population believes that women with young children should not work full-time, and at the same time, there is a very high long-run penalty from parenthood. Now, one may and should think that perhaps those relationships between norms and outcomes do not necessarily reflect causality from norms to outcomes. One can think, for example, of some sort of exposed rationalization of the outcome. So if in a country, for whatever reason, women have especially poor labor market prospects, one way to rationalize that would be to think, oh, well, perhaps that's for the better. Perhaps this is the best thing for mothers and for their children. But there's also causal evidence that shows that indeed conservative gender norms may have causal impacts on the marriage market and the labor market. So in the second time, I'm just going to show you one figure here about the consequences of one possibly prescriptive norm, the norm that in conservative societies, men should be the breadwinners in their families. This is not exactly a conservative society. This graph represents the distribution of the share of family income earned by women in the US. And then, as you can see, this distribution is highly unbalanced. You have a lot of density here to the left of the 50% line, meaning that in the vast majority of couples, the women earn the minority share of income and the men earn the majority share. And there is much less density here to the right of the 50% line. But one important fact to notice is that there is a sharp drop in the density in correspondence of exactly the 50% line. And then you can think of models of marriage formation, for example, models in which the division of labor is based on comparative advantages, returns in the labor market. All these models may explain why perhaps in the majority of couples, the women are the minor contributor to family income, but none of this economic explanation can generate this kind of sharp drop. So one potential explanation is perhaps that the 50% line represents exactly the point at which females become the breadwinners in their families. So once you move to the left, from the left to the right, women become breadwinners in their families, and this would break this kind of conservative gender norm. I'd like to spend a couple of minutes about what we can learn on all the questions I've been asking so far: the role of flexibility and working from home, the role of conservative gender norms. So what can we learn on these very important questions from the recent experience from the pandemic? So the pandemic has generated temporary but unprecedented changes in the organization of work, both in the market and in the household. So for example, if you look at the proportion of people working from home, this chart here gives you on the solid red line the proportion of women with children who were working from home before the pandemic and then since the start of the pandemic. The solid blue line shows you the same graph for fathers, and the dashed line are the respective graphs for childless individuals. You can see that the proportion of individuals working from home among both genders has increased substantially since the beginning of the pandemic, and even after the end of the lockdowns has remained permanently higher than what it used to be. If anything, it's higher among mothers than all other groups in society. And in particular, the incidence of flexible work arrangements, including flexible hours, annualized hours, zero-hour contracts, or any other kind of work arrangement that is not simply 9 to 5, Monday to Friday, the incidence is so much higher among mothers than among everyone else. So now, at the end of various lockdowns, we probably need to reflect what are the permanent consequences of this kind of changing nature of work in the labor market, and also we should add in the house. This chart here represents what was happening to hours of childcare. All the time, before the pandemic and during the pandemic, women, represented by the red bars, were always doing a lot more childcare than men. About twice as much or even more than twice as much as men. But as you can see with the pandemic, the whole amount of childcare has increased enormously, understandably, because for most of this period, the schools were closed. Now, what would be the permanent legacies of all of that? Now, in terms of working from home, before the pandemic, there was very strong resistance of managers and employers to move to models of smart working. So the main narrative was that smart working is just too complicated from an organizational point of view. So we prefer to have employees working in the office, possibly 9 to 5, possibly in a coordinated manner. But the thing is that after 2 years of most of us doing a lot of work from home, and things sort of work more or less okay, it's hard to argue that things cannot be done otherwise than sitting in an office 9 to 5, Monday to Friday. So there's many reasons to believe that at least some of the working from home habit will perhaps stick. So most workplaces are adopting hybrid arrangements, and most employees expect to continue to work from home at least part of the time. So for example, in the UK, as soon as the lockdown started, all employees, men, women, with or without children, started to form expectations about a willingness to continue to work from home, at least in part in the future. So even after the end of the lockdowns, you can see that the near totality of employees were sort of expecting to continue to work from home. Very similarly in the US, about between 40 and 50% of men and women, respectively, expect to continue to work from home for part of the time after the pandemic. Now, what are the career impacts of that? One may argue that this kind of forced experimentation with working from home and flexible work arrangements during COVID may teach us ways to reduce the penalties typically associated to non-standard forms of work, something that we haven't learned before when working from home was not a forced experimentation. So perhaps we are learning things that we didn't learn before simply because of inertia or lack of imagination. There's going to be a reduced significance of distance, so even workers with caring responsibilities can reach out to job opportunities further afield. But there's a bunch of open questions that we should really investigate these days. So to what extent will high-profile jobs be doable from home? And is there a value at all to presenteeism? So is there a value to being physically present at work in terms, for example, of building significant work networks, of being taken into account when thinking about important projects to assign to employees, or promotions to give to staff? So this is really something on which the jury is still out. Now, on the evolving norms path, perhaps the evidence is still a little bit too early to give us lessons, but something that I would like to show here is what was happening to parents who were mostly in charge of childcare before and during COVID. The first chart here, the first pie on the left, shows who was mostly in charge of childcare before COVID. In 57% of households, it was the mother. 40% of households, it was mostly shared. Tiny minority, 2.9%, it was the fathers. During lockdown, for female, it was again 58%, so nothing really changed for mothers. But for men, actually something very important changed because, for fathers here, something very important changed because the proportion of families where father became in charge of childcare became about 18%. So this has witnessed, this 18% of families have witnessed the reversal of traditional gender roles in a very dramatic fashion. So the key question is whether this could bring to some evolution, to some learning, to some change in gender roles in the future. So our fathers in those families believe or expected to change their involvement in childcare once we go back to normality. And here the evidence is not very optimistic because what I'm showing here in this graph is the share of childcare hours performed by fathers. This is pre-COVID, just below 40%. This is during lockdown, around 40%. And this is after lockdown, August, September last year. So when all schools were back in place. And as you can see, if anything, the proportion of male childcare hours has fallen. So for the moment, there isn't really very strong indicative evidence that norms are going to evolve, at least in childcare provision. Now, very briefly, I'm going to conclude with a very simple discussion of policies. I've been talking about the nature and organization of work, but then there's a whole sort of range of policies that we can consider when it comes to supporting equal gender roles. So first of all, there can be gender neutral family policies like subsidized childcare, in-work benefits. So those policies should provide substitutes to maternal childcare and therefore break this kind of primary role of mothers in childcare provision. And also there can be counter-stereotypical policies like the introduction of daddy quotas, for example. Now here, one can probably argue that all these policies have limited traction. They face an uphill battle whenever conservative norms are deep-rooted. So for example, in Austria, this picture here shows what happened to the motherhood penalty before and after the expansion in childcare places. So the Austrian government expanded by a lot the funding of childcare places and did so in a staggered way across Austrian municipalities. What this graph is showing is that the red and the blue lines representing the penalties in municipalities with a lot of childcare provision and the penalty in municipalities with very little childcare provision, they completely sit on top of one another. So one potential explanation is that perhaps conservative gender norms prevent the substitution of mothers from this primary role of childcare. Another explanation is, of course, that if one really needs flexibility in working hours, because when the child is sick, you cannot really leave them at nursery, you have to pick them up and drop whatever you're doing, then another explanation is that perhaps subsidized nursery places are not enough. Another very interesting view about policies is that there can be policies that can try to counter stereotypes directly via education and the media. And now here we can think of a lot of reasons why education and the media play a very important role in either reinforcing stereotypes or fighting stereotypes. So for example, the UK since 2018 has in place legislation that makes it illegal to show commercial adverts that portray some stereotypical roles. So it is illegal to show, for example, men who are unable to do a particular female task simply because of a stereotypical role. So I don't know if you remember this kind of advert for the Philadelphia cheese. This was the first advert that was banned because it was suggested that men were incapable of caring for children. So it was portraying these dads having a drink in a bar and forgetting a child on a sort of conveyor belt for takeaway food. So basically, this kind of advert has now become illegal because it portrays men to be incapable of caring for children and actually makes it look sort of cool to do so. So this is no longer possible. Okay, so I would like to leave a bit of time for the discussion. Let me conclude with a very simple summary of this kind of talk. I have shown evidence that gender gaps are pervasive and also persistent, and they can be largely traced to barriers and norms. Now, the policies to address them are to a large extent an uphill battle, but the positive view is that norms and stereotypes are not immutable. So there have been a lot of examples in the earlier or even recent history in which gender norms actually evolved to changes in legislation after exposure to female leaders and after sort of exercises aimed at debiasing the public opinion. So thank you so much for attending this talk, and I'm looking forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Barbara, for that talk. And before we do dive into questions, I want to say that there's already been a request for you to share your slides. Sure. If that's possible, I think people might be very interested in that. All right, so I think there are loads of questions, and we are going to try to structure them into blocks. So let's actually start with social norms and preferences, because that's something that seems to be very important still for gender gaps. So would you say that these gender gaps in social norms, so for example, children suffer if mom works when they're young and things like that, do you think they're actually driven by policy and institutional constraints, or do you think of them as more as pure preferences in these different populations?
So I'm very happy to take this question. I think it's a very important question. So the key question is, what is the origin of gender norms? And then one can think of like intrinsically held beliefs, peer pressures, or basically some kind of equilibrium which is induced by some sort of policy configuration. So for example, when I was talking about job flexibility and job characteristics that are favored by women, one can think of part-time jobs, jobs with especially flexible schedules, or family-friendly policies that allow women to take time off from the labor market when they have children, to take breaks, for example, when their children are sick. All these kind of institutions, which could be firm-level practices or policies, they might help combine motherhood and careers, but they also may induce an unequal allocation of working time if the take-up rate of those policies or practices mostly falls on women. So those kind of institutions or firm-level practices may actually exacerbate inequality and even induce more conservative norms if they facilitate more gendered allocation of labor. So I completely sympathize with this kind of question. When we think about policies, we really should think about what is the take-up rate and the kind of gender equilibrium that policies can generate. So one obvious example is, of course, parental leave, that the bulk of the entitlement still falls on women.
Thanks. And I think we've already kind of talked about some policy measures that policymakers could take. So for example, providing childcare and things like that. What role do you see for tax systems when it comes to the gender pay gap? So for example, in Germany, of course, there's the system of Ehegatten splitting. So where a married couple would kind of income would be equalized across them to determine the rate of the income tax that they pay. So what are these kind of tax system differences? What role do they play for the gender pay gap?
this is also an important factor. So as you correctly mentioned, Lisa, in countries that have joint couple taxation, the secondary earners are more heavily taxed. So far as secondary earners are women, you should expect that female involvement in the labor market bears a higher tax penalty. While in countries in which taxation is individual, of course, this would not happen. Now, this argument has been taken forward by legislators in many countries by introducing tax credits for working families. And given that the tax credits are typically means tested and are also conditional on the presence of children, the take-up rate mostly falls on mothers. So there is evidence, especially for the US in this case, a little bit less for the UK, that working family tax credits, for example, has generated an incentive for the participation of mothers, especially single mothers. So this has been a very important policy instrument to incentivize the participation of mothers to the labor market.
Okay, so I think we are jumping between topics a little bit more than I had planned, so sorry for that in advance. But maybe we could come back to COVID and the charts that you showed on the effects of COVID. So the fact that men are doing an even lower share of childcare now than before COVID is really striking. Do we know anything about patterns of heterogeneity by education level and things like that?
So I'm afraid this evidence is extremely recent. And then this graph that I was showing here shows data coming from all sorts of different sources. So pre-COVID is time use data. And then during COVID here in 2020 and 2021, they come from the same survey, the Understanding Society, but based on slightly different questions. So we should really be very cautious before extrapolating from these trends. The pattern of childcare gaps by education during COVID, they mostly reflected gender gaps in occupation. So basically what determined most of parental involvement in childcare was what kind of job you do, whether you work in an occupation where you can work from home, you work in an occupation where you have to be furloughed, or you work in a critical occupation. So for example, if you work in healthcare, you're working more than full time, so you cannot do any childcare at all, which is probably why in many families, the father was most in charge of childcare because perhaps the mother were working in critical occupation. So during COVID, what we have learned was mostly based on the occupational choices of fathers and mothers. Going forward, we definitely need a lot more data about the childcare distribution between parents.
Okay. And maybe just briefly staying on the topic of COVID, do you see any risk from these kind of new developments, such as like work from home and this additional flexibility? Because you've just mentioned that sometimes this comes at the expense of female leisure time. So do you think that these new possibilities will just put further pressure on the leisure time, because now expectations have just increased that women do need to do childcare, but now they're also able to work from home. So do you see any risk there at all if the effort is not concerted enough? So now firms provide these opportunities, but social norms aren't really changing. So what are the risks there?
So the risk is, for example, that whoever is working from home and also looking after the children, by definition, is expected to tick all the boxes and do it all. And there is also some preliminary evidence on that. For example, a study from the IFS has shown that women from home during the pandemic were doing so with a lot more sort of family-related interruptions than men. So again, the risk might be one of having to do it all. Another risk is, of course, that we still have to show that working from home doesn't bear any penalty in terms of earning trajectories and promotions and development of career. So that's why I said that on this particular path, the COVID provides an extremely interesting testing ground, but the jury is still out about what will be the long-run consequences of new forms of work arrangements.
We've had another question kind of relating to social norms from Ireland. So to the extent that norms are completely internalized as preferences by both men and women, is it right to try to change them?
It is probably very hard to tell to what extent norms reflect preferences as opposed to societal influences or peer pressure. It's extremely hard. And also from an evolutionary perspective, it has been argued that even if there is a sort of genetic component of that, the fact that different people can be genetically predisposed to different experiences may have impact, for example, in the long run development through fertility, through authoritative making, etc. So perhaps that is a distinction that doesn't help all that much. Now, some of the existing evidence, which is really interesting because it also comes from countries that are extremely gender conservative on the spectrum, on the sort of international spectrum, is that a lot of these gender norms are indeed coming from some kind of pluralistic ignorance or misperception about what your peers may think. So, for example, there is a study on Saudi Arabia, so very much at the other end of the spectrum of gender norms from Scandinavia, which we've just been looking at, in which an experiment has shown that a relatively large majority of men, about 80% of the interviewed men, believes that there's nothing wrong with their wives working in the labor market. But the same men believe that only 60% of their peers believe so. So individually, people are convinced about relatively liberal gender norms, but they believe that everyone else has more conservative norms, and therefore they might suffer from social stigma if they start to send their women to work. And I'm saying sending the women to work not lightly, because in Saudi Arabia, typically female participation requires husband's consent. So in a case like that, information is of course very important, because if there is a misperception of norms, then it simply means that giving people the right information, which is actually what this experiment has done, would induce a change in behavior. So after this experiment, the participants were given correct information on the beliefs of their peers. And the experiment shows that men who got the expectations wrong at the beginning actually changed their behavior by allowing the women to sign up for a job matching app that was especially sort of geared towards the female labor market. So there is some evidence that actually gender norms can change with simply an informational treatment, which casts quite a bit of doubt on the fact that everything boils down to genetics and preferences.
So that intervention already shows, I guess, that even informational interventions like that can have an effect. So we've also had a question about progressive policies, such as equalizing maternal and paternal leave, whether that can have a significant impact on affecting societal norms. So whether there's any evidence on that. So whether men would be more willing to actively participate in childcare and take parental leave when they are incentivized like that.
There is some evidence that daddy's quota in parental leave are welcome. And now I'm just going back to the graph I had on Sweden, this graph here. So certainly the quotas within parental leave are welcome to induce fathers to participate in childcare. And I'm saying quotas because typically when you leave the share to be decided voluntarily by parents, again, women take the vast amount of parental childcare, so basically of parental leave. So it doesn't seem to be equally shared at all. So even in Scandinavia, though, even in Sweden, as you can see, fathers who take parental leave, they take 2 months because this is what has been allocated to them, or they might take more than that voluntarily. But you can see that their earnings really go back to the pre-birth level. For women, no matter how much leave their partners are taking, the earnings never go back to the pre-level. So it seems that these kind of policies are welcome in the long run if they manage to induce an evolution of gender norms. But in the short run, just taking at face value the take-up rate that we observe in Sweden, they don't really seem to help with the permanent penalty.
We've also had an interesting question about kind of unintended consequences of policies. So for example, policies that are actually aimed at helping, for example, women who have children. So for example, maternity leave. Do you see that they could contribute to increasing actually gender stereotypes? And are there better policies that could change the situation?
Yes, the answer is that indeed it may happen that long maternal leave, for example, could possibly strengthen gender stereotypes, because it would even more reinforce this kind of comparative advantage of mothers into childcare. So employers, co-workers, society at large would become even more accustomed to the fact that women are the primary provider of childcare. So there is that kind of risk. In reality, one would say, therefore, childcare would be a more neutral form of family policies, because this would provide a substitute to both maternal childcare and paternal childcare. Now, in reality, it's not that easy to make a clear divide between parental leave and childcare subsidies, because in reality, it has been shown that the response of gender gaps to publicly funded childcare has been relatively muted. So the case about Austria that I've just shown you before is probably one extreme case in which publicly funded childcare didn't have any impact at all on gender gaps. At the other end of the spectrum, there is, of course, the US, in which subsidies to childcare have been particularly low historically. So any increase of those subsidies via preschool programs or nursery programs indeed have an impact on maternal participation. So perhaps, I mean, maybe that's not very helpful, but I should say that the answer to these questions is largely context dependent. So in a context in which there are conservative norms and society largely believes that mother is best at doing childcare, perhaps state-provided childcare doesn't help us that much. In a context in which norms are more liberal and in which the constraint is really the fact that there is very little free or heavily subsidized or cheap childcare available to parents, in that case, that might be the binding constraint. So in that case, childcare programs may help.
And kind of a large shift, I guess, but we have had a question about the situation in developing countries, even though your talk focused mostly on the situation in developed economies. But we had Aditya ask, in a developing country like Indonesia, the challenge is to open access to education for women. So with the increasingly expensive cost of education, what could be done about that? So maybe you could say a little bit about gender gaps in developing countries and the role of education.
This is a very important question, and actually I have no very good excuse for not talking in this particular talk about developing countries, other than for the sake of time, one makes some hard choices. And basically the main idea is that there are institutions and labor market and education issues in developing countries that may not be the same as those that we face in high income countries. So one key point about many developing countries is that a lot of female participation to the labor market is indeed unpaid. So if one looks at official statistics, female participation in those official statistics like paid employment is a lot lower than what is actually true female participation, because there is a lot of female work, for example, in agriculture or unpaid family businesses. So this is one point that has to be taken into account when we try to draw lessons for developing countries. Another point is that the motherhood penalty in developing countries is not necessarily associated to level of norms. Sometimes it's also associated to the share of agriculture, simply because when women work on the unpaid, as unpaid members of the family businesses, this kind of work is largely compatible with childcare. So it seems that the childcare penalty is not as large, even in contexts with conservative norms, when women are mostly working in a domestic environment. And then third, of course, as it was noted by this question, the education gap is still sort of, there's still a positive gap. The education gap hasn't closed yet in developing countries, as it has closed in the OECD countries, as I was showing at the beginning of this chart, of this talk. So basically, the idea is that there are relatively different problems and different institutions, and one should start, first of all, about the participation of girls in education.
Okay, thank you so much, Barbara, and thank you for everyone for sending their questions. We didn't get around to all of them, but I hope we did address the majority of them. So yeah, I just want to say another thank you to Barbara and to the organizers, and everybody who joined us today. Do keep an eye out for this seminar series next year. So this was the last seminar for this academic year, but I'm pretty sure we'll be back with more seminars in this format. Okay, thank you everyone, and have a good day.
Thank you very much, Lisa. Thank you, everyone.